Greetings, everyone. This is Ahav Ever for the Chronicles of Ahav Ever. And today I'm going to do a video. Hopefully, it'll be somewhat short, but recently I got a question concerning the issue of conversion to, I guess, Judaism, which I guess, well, I'll be covering this from a standpoint of Torath Mosheh. Um, but I think this is sometimes a complicated issue to try to answer, especially I kind of consider that whenever this question comes up from people, it's probably almost better to like call them and talk to them personally about it. But I've wanted to do a video on a similar topic to what was brought up. And essentially the question is this. Um, there's a basic issue when it comes to people who decide that they want to be Jewish in some format or to become to join Judaism and things like that. Now, one of the difficulties I think that people will have, especially when they're talking to me from this perspective, is that the reality is that Torath Moshe is not a religion. It's not what people would consider to be a religion when you break it down to its basic bare bones. Meaning that generally speaking, and I've said this in other videos, that when a person joins a religion, usually there's some kind of creed or something that they just kind of have to state. And once they state it and say they believe in it, from there they can just say they're part of the religion. And whether they show up to the building where this religion is practiced or not, or whether they never show up or not, it's almost like doesn't really matter. There's no real requirement in most religions for someone to show up to a particular place for a particular reason. There's no real requirement for someone to be a part of a particular nation, so to speak. It's mainly just about belief and the principles of belief that a person has. The Torah is not like that at all. Essentially saying when a person wants to live as a Jew, you're not joining a particular ideology, you're not joining a particular belief system. There's no requirement for belief in the Torah whatsoever. The Torah, never in Hebrew, makes a statement of belief or creeds. Now, one of the things that does exist is that there have been various leaders of the Jewish people throughout history who have stated that there are some foundations. You know, in English, foundation would probably be the better terminology for the Torah. The Rambam, for example, right by Moshe ben Maimon, came up with 13 things that in English people often call them principles of faith, but the text that is usually quoted is something that he didn't even write. And I think I've mentioned this also before. So the important thing to remember is that the basic principle of Torath Moshe is that at a place called Har Sinai, Mount Sinai, the Creator of all things presented itself to the entire nation of Israel, including in that nation at the time were people who had left Egypt with the people of Israel, who descended from a person named Yaakov, who also descended from a person named Yitzhak, and also descended from a person named Avraham. And essentially, there were other people there besides those direct blood descendants, for example. And when the Torah was given, that formed all those people into a nation, which that means that there were some people who had different positions in that nation, different responsibilities in that nation, on different perspectives. You know, so essentially, the two groups that could exist in that nation are essentially made up of people who are Bnei Yisrael, and those are people who descend directly from Yaakov. And this basically mean three types of people, actually, I should say. Bnei Yisrael, people who are descendants in some biological way to Yaakov, ben Yitzhak, and another group called Geirim, people who are at Mount Sinai who did not come from a familiar link to Yaakov ben Yitzhak, and then essentially a third group called Geritoshav, and a Geritoshav would basically have been a person who um, unlike the person who was called Geret Tzedek, as we call him. A Geret Tzedek is someone who decided that they wanted to live exactly as a person born of the direct descent from Yaakov bin Yitzhak. So, for example, whatever mitzvot that Hashem gave that were required for descendants of Yaakov bin Yitzhak, a Geret Tzedek, for example, would decide, okay, I want to live exactly like that. That's exactly what I want. They would have to go before what's called a Bet Din, which is like a judicial council or Torah-based judicial council to express this. And then from there, they would have to be essentially brought into the nation. It's almost like the type of, if you will, citizenship, permanent citizenship. Once a person made the decision, they can't go back and say, oh, I changed my mind. I don't want to be part of the Jewish nation. Well, too late now. You've already got permanent citizenship. That's something you should have considered from the start. And that because, one of the reasons that is that every Jew now is responsible for this one person, whether they decide to go back and do something that goes against the Torah or not. Now, the Toshav is different. A Geritoshav being the third group of people, and that essentially Geritoshav has decided that they want to do what's called the Sheva Mitzvot. The Sheva Mitzvot being the baseline or the basis of all humanity, meaning that if a person is like, let's say, on the other side of the world, um, let's say that we go back several thousand years ago, a person living in this area of, of the world in America, um, they would be incumbent upon what's incumbent upon them is the Sheva Mitzvot, because of the fact that that is the basis of all humanity. Where when you get to Israel, in the Middle East, the Jewish people who have been around here are responsible for the Torah that was given at Mount Sinai. Now, in just a second, I'll explain why this map is even showing, because you might wonder, like, why am I even looking at this map? Why is it pointing towards America? So let's think about this. Okay, so we have that there were three groups, for example, that were at Mount Sinai when the Torah was given. And I'll move this kind of to the area that we might say that happened in. Essentially, what we're looking at is a situation that when the people of Israel left Mitzrayim and went to an area where Mount Sinai was and walked away from Mount Sinai and came into this area here, they had formed a nation. And we know that nations have citizenships. So one of the important things that has to be noted here is that one of the key elements of the Torah is that in the land of Israel, Avodah Zarah is not allowed. Now, Avodah Zarah I've covered in another video, previous video, and you can go back to that video to kind of look for what exactly that means. But essentially, Avodah Zarah is not allowed in the land of Israel. So that means that people who were born from, the family of Yaakov bin Yitzhak are not allowed to do Avodah Zarah. People who are Geirim, Gerit Tzedek, they're not allowed to do Avodah Zarah. And even a Geritoshav who only has these 7 mitzvot that they've accepted and who is not living like a Jew, but because they've accepted this 7 mitzvot, are allowed to live in the land of Israel. Essentially, they also, one of the 7 mitzvot is to reject and to not do Avodah Zarah. So that's the basis of where I want to start with this discussion concerning this question of conversion, for example. Now, one of the important things about when the Torah was given is that there's no requirement in the Torah for the Jewish people to perform conversions, meaning to make someone into a Gerit Tzedek. There's no requirement for that whatsoever. There are mitzvot that tell you, for example, in the written Torah, there's mitzvot to tell you how to treat a person once they are a Gerit Tzedek, but there's no requirements to say, okay, if someone approaches you and says, I want to live as a Jew, you must make them a Gerit Tzedek. Nothing in the Torah that says that. Um, further to that point, a person might say, I want to be a Geritoshav, meaning the person who only kept the Sheva mitzvot of Noach. Well, the main requirement there is that for a person to enter into the land of Israel during this time of a Malchut, a Torah-based nation, a person who was not a part of the Jewish people was not allowed to even enter this land without, having accepted the Sheva mitzvot of Noach. And the Rambam, for example, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon explains that this would have taken place before Beit Din, which makes sense. If you're talking about a nation that keeps the Torah, border control would, of course, said, okay, well, we don't allow Avodah Zarah in this nation. Someone walking in with a bunch of like idols, for example, because Avodah Zarah, one way in English is translated as idolatry, wouldn't have been let in the border because, the issue is that that's not allowed in the land of Israel. So that would have meant that everybody coming in would have had to have, kept the Sheva Mitzvah Noach if they were not from the family of Yaakov. So that's a starting point. And I've given the sources for some of this stuff in different videos, so I'm not going to like really cover too deeply in this one. So this brings us to a question: if the Jewish people are not required to perform conversions, if there's no actual mitzvah that says we must perform conversions, what is the status in the modern era of us, performing conversions for people who decide that they want to join the Jewish nation? And I think it goes back to what we were saying earlier, because we're not talking about a religion, we're talking about a nation of people who have like national requirements and national borders. Essentially, what you're looking at is a situation where the Jewish people can decide in, whatever terms, to accept or to not accept someone to be able to join that nation. Again, there's no requirement for a non-Jew to become a Jew. Non-Jew can do the will of the Creator of all things and not be Jewish, by keeping the Sheva Mitzvah Noach. And at the same time, the Jewish nation can bring someone to become a Jew, as long as that person is willing to accept whatever the national requirements are. And those national requirements could even include how long it takes to become a Gerit Tzedek. And this is one of the things I find interesting about the debate that takes place online about like what is the time frame of conversion. Well, here's the thing that I find interesting, and I think I discussed this during the conversion video I did. Um, think of it this way: you have national borders. You have the land of Israel that has rules, meaning that those rules are set in place by a Mosaic court, which is known as the Sanhedrin or Bedin Gadol, as well as a melech, a king over the land of Israel. Consider how silly it would sound if someone were to come across to the border here and say, hey, I want to become a citizen of your Torah-based nation, but I want to do it within 10 minutes. Well, you don't get to decide what that means. I mean, we're the ones who get to decide that, not you. You don't get to decide that. And we're not being mean about it. We're just simply saying, okay, if you grew up, let's say here in this desert, and you grew up doing Avodah Zarah, and as a lifetime of Avodah Zarah, let's say you grew up like and you're 26 years old and you've grown up doing about, let's say, 20 years of Avodah Zarah. Well, we need to know before you walk on the border that you're not bringing that in here and that you understand what that means to us. Because if you don't know what Avodah Zarah is, or the basis behind it, well, we need to explain it to you, and you may need to take a course on the border here just to be able to have us allow you in. And that's true of any group of people. I mean, you don't just show up to any country's border and say, hey, well, I want to be a citizen right now. I mean, most people don't do that unless there's some asylum seeking that you're seeking, something like that. So that's the first issue, that the process of bringing someone into the Jewish nation is something determined by, those Jews who know Torah. I mean, now that's the other aspect of, I think, that's interesting about this issue. Does a person who has no knowledge of the Torah, who's never read something in Hebrew before, who his knowledge of the Torah and the Jewish law is very limited, do they have the right to tell someone whose experience is a lot longer and deeper into it how they should be brought into the Jewish nation, or if at all they should be brought into the Jewish nation? And that's, again, this, I think some people may take this as that sounds kind of mean, but again, we're not talking about a religion where you come down and sit down and do a creed. We're talking about a nation of people who have national requirements. Um, you can even go back and look at it like this. I mean, let's say you go to the point where the Jewish nation had been conquered by some of the nations in these areas here and dispersed. So you had Jews, let's say that, let's look at it from this angle. Jews that got dispersed and ended up, let's say, in Morocco. So Jews are living in exile. They've been dispersed. So some in Morocco, some in Spain. And all of a sudden, some person from the Moroccan desert who decides he wants to be a Jew. Well, during that time, during that exile, there may have been a lot of, I guess you could say, Jewish isolationism in terms of being away from the average society around. I mean, if you're Jews living in a part of Morocco, like let's say the hills, living in out that exile, and all of a sudden someone who's not Jewish decides that they want to be Jewish, you have to kind of question that, because you might say, okay, well, wait a minute. Why all of a sudden does this person want to be a Jew? I mean, 10 minutes ago, they didn't want to be a Jew. We're pretty much getting our butts kicked everywhere. We got exiled all the way from here, and we're now over here. What would interest this person who want to be Jewish when we're in exile? And that's a big question, and that's something that a person may have to investigate. There have been situations in history where Jews have had the nations that they were exiled into, basically have people accusing the Jews of doing all kinds of things that didn't make any sense. I mean, there's places, for example, up in Europe, where they were accusing Jews of different various blood libels and things like that. So after years and years and centuries of those kind of things happening, someone all of a sudden decides, I want to be a Jew. It's like, well, why? Why would you want to do that? I mean, we're basically getting our butts kicked. And if you go back to what I mentioned in the conversion video, the Rambam actually mentions this, that one of the first questions if a person decides they want to be Jewish, he says the first thing you do is investigate them. He says you investigate them, and he doesn't explain how long, he doesn't explain how. So what you can pretty much come to the conclusion that it's up to the discretion of the Jewish community to decide, you know, it's questionable situation. Okay, why all of a sudden does this person want to be Jewish? If we're at the bottom of the totem pole, for example, if we're getting attacked on all sides, who's to say this person won't be a part of that attack? That they don't join the Jewish community and then inform on the Jewish community to our enemies. So that's a question. And you can say, okay, in the modern time we don't have that as much. In the modern time we kind of do. But let's go back and take this a little bit further. Let's take that element out. And again, I'm just presenting that to explain a particular perspective. Okay, so we've already concluded that Jews don't have a requirement to convert anyone. We've already explained that after the exile, which was several thousand years long, and even still is in effect today, even though there are Jews living in Israel, we're still in exile. Look at it from this perspective. We have no requirement to convert. We just have a requirement to have treat people who have converted. We have no requirement to seek out proselytes. There's no mitzvah that says we must. A community, a Jewish community, for example, let's say, and let's say we have a Jewish community in France. They may look around them and say, okay, we don't have enough resources or people in this area. We need to form a community. We don't have enough community, so let's maybe look for people who are in the minority in this region, for example, And if they're interested, let's make them Jews, just so we have enough women for our sons to marry, things like that. And that would be more the typical situation that someone may say, okay, my son doesn't have anyone to marry. Let's find some woman that maybe on the lower totem pole of the society, and maybe bring her in so that my son can marry someone once she's converted and becomes a Jew, and therefore that has an advantage. But then once that situation is settled, there's no reason to do conversions again. That can be a reason. But generally speaking, you look and say, okay, well, let's just convert some people and just throw them in. I mean, that might not be to someone's best advantage if you're talking about a community, not just religion. Religions may look and say, we need numbers. So therefore, let's convert everybody can just to build up our numbers, just for some political reason, or, for some, you could say in the religions that believe in salvation, where, in order for them to get their way, the world has to become just like them. The Torah never provides anything like that in terms of a situation. So going back, you may say, okay, well, a person, let's say in America, decides they want to convert and they want to be a Jew. The Jewish community can say, based on what the Rambam says, you have to test them. Okay, well, one way to test someone is to say, why do you want to be a Jew? A person gives a response. Okay, well, if you want to be a Jew, seriously, you have to move into the Jewish community. The person may say, well, I live, let's say here, the closest Jewish community is over here. Well, you need to move with us because we're a nation. We're not, a religion in that way. I mean, if you want to live some isolated life here where there's no Jews, then you could do that without ever having to become a Jew. I mean, you could live that lifestyle as like, the person who keeps the seven mitzvot of Noach on your own there, if that's the way you're going to be. But we're Jewish people. We don't survive, generally speaking, outside of a community. Um, Now, that's sometimes hard for people who to understand when they come from more of a religious and even like a Western background, where the idea of joining a nation of people or joining a culture as a part of like a national sense is not exactly something that's understood, because the nation they're living in is that national sense. And there are even some Jews in the West who don't fully understand it because they can blend in to the Western mindset, where there are some other countries in the world where if you're a Jew, you're not really a part of the system. You're not really a part of the nationality. You're just kind of allowed to be there. So just to kind of touch on this issue a little bit more, a person who is interested in being Jewish, one of the things I mentioned in the other video that I usually suggest is I usually suggest that they live as a Noahide for about a year or two, and that they try to get themselves as fluent in Hebrew as possible. And what happens with that is it makes it a lot easier for a rabbi or like a bet din, which is a bet din is a council of three rabbis who basically preside over a situation of conversion. It makes it easier for them to make a case for the person to potentially be a part of that community if they already are living in the Jewish community, a Jewish community. If they've already like done things like, let's say, learn Hebrew. If they've already done things like, for example, they know what books to read, they already have like been learning from someone, and they've been doing it, and here's the big kicker of it. They've been doing it not for the sake of being a Jew, but they've been doing it for the sake of drawing close to the creator of all things, Hashem. That's the one thing that sometimes a lot of rabbis don't hear from people who are interested in becoming Jewish, that the person's more interested in doing the will of the creator of all things rather than anything else. Because the one thing the Rambam mentions, which is really interesting, he says that when a person is doing tefillah and when a person is like coming close to Hashem, they should do it not for the sake of reward, meaning that in the world to come there's a reward. They should do it as if they want no reward. They should do it simply for the sake that they love the creator of all things and they want to draw close without any sign of reward whatsoever, which is a tough sell to make to people if you're going to say, okay, here's all these troubles and trials and tribulations, but should say to yourself, I don't care for what the reward. The Rambam wasn't saying there wasn't a reward. He's simply saying that the perspective of the person who is like a really big tzaddik, someone who's really close to Hashem, is one who approaches it and says, I don't care about the reward. I just love the connection I have with the Creator. So when I pray, I'm praying because of the fact that I love the connection, not specifically because I want something from the Creator. The Creator is not like a bank, which I'm looking to get money out of. Is just simply I like the connection I have with the creator, and that's what's the main focus. And that's not easy sometimes for people in the West to fully understand. Now, just to put this in perspective, okay, a person may say, well, why does it take years to do a conversion? Well, I've already talked about what things you may have to require. I mean, you're joining a nation. We have a national language. Hebrew is not a language that generally speaking a person learns in 10 minutes or less, especially when you're talking about several thousand years of it, which is like a general requirement. Someone becomes a Jew, let's say here, speaks no Hebrew, and all the Jews here speak Hebrew. This person may feel left out because they don't speak the national language. But these people grew up with the language, so they know the language. Now, here's the bigger kicker to all of this. A person may look here and say, why is it so hard to be a Jew here in America, for example? Well, I'm going to tell you a little story. I used to do work with a group of people who were from here in Nigeria. There's a group, ethnic group known as the Igbo, who live in Nigeria, and I used to do work with them of somewhere between about 2005, I think it was, no, 2003, 2005. And over there, at the time, there was no Jewish community anywhere in this area whatsoever. There were certain Igbos who believed that they had Jewish ancestry, but they couldn't tell you how. And there was, some people who took it in different strides about what that meant. But one of the things that happened was a grassroots group of people, or Igbos, decided that they were going to live as Jews as the best they could. So essentially, what they did was they went out and built themselves their own synagogues. They built their own Bet Knesset, and they essentially whatever information they could get either through the internet or through like Israelis who like came to Nigeria working for some of the oil companies or who were visiting, and then they run into someone and they're wearing a kippah. Someone's like, hey, wait a minute, you're a Jew? And they're like, oh, well, we're Evos. And then a person may give them a siddur, a prayer book. Someone may give them like a Torah, Chumash. And eventually what happened was, and I worked with one guy who started out by himself. He went from building up a community of 7 guys who were meeting in his apartment to like 30, and they built their own synagogue, just from the ground up with no financial support externally. From there, I sent them like books, any kind of sidurim I could get them, and other groups, sent them things. And eventually they built themselves up to where there were like 3 or 4 Jewish communities in different areas. And I think now there's even like more. And there was like one guy who wasn't an Igbo. He was from another ethnic group where he essentially like was able to get a Torah scroll from America, and because he went through and did a conservative conversion in America, which it's not what I would suggest, but he himself even said this is the best I can do right now, but so be it. Um, but all of this was grassroots. Now the thing was, some of them actually went through and were able to convert to Judaism. It took years. I mean, there's a number of them that didn't get any of that for like years. And this is not saying that they had to go through a conversion of years. This is to say that before they could even get to the point of doing it was like years, because of the fact that they were in a nation that at the time didn't have really any Jews there. And eventually a Chabad synagogue was started in Nigeria. But generally speaking, Chabad is mostly focused on people who are already Jewish. And they did get some help from the Chabad that was there. But the thing that was interesting and important was this group of people, they weren't concerned about the conversions, the ones I was working with. They were more concerned about doing what they thought was right to reconnect with an ancestry which they believed was Jewish. They also believed that they were coming close to the Creator, Hashem, in a way that was realistic, which was the main focus. And I remember one of the guys I was working with even saying this himself, because there was a group I was thinking about connecting with that was in Israel, but they weren't really concerned about the Torah. He said, don't have anything to do with those people. They're not like us. We want the Torah. And the thing is that there's a right way to do that. And if we do it the right way, that's what's pleasing to Hashem, and not like any other path. So that's the thing that's interesting, because their mindset, being in a traditional society that they were in, was to simply build it for themselves, and then whatever happens, when Hashem is ready, and that's an important element. That if a person in a situation, it's either because Hashem has allowed it or caused it to happen. And it's up to the person to figure out which one that means. So the difficulty right now with the current Corona situation and conversion is it's not easy to just up and move to a Jewish community. With lockdowns and things like that happening, and with the basic spread of something like this with Corona, with COVID-19, there are a lot of communities that are like on lockdown, and conversions are not like the high priority. Before COVID, conversions, again, they're not a requirement, so they're not a high priority. And a person may feel like they really have to be Jewish, but again, that's where you have to pray to the Creator and see what the will of the Creator is. I mean, one of the important things in life that we all have to learn in life, no matter who we are, is that there are some situations that are like based upon opportunity. There's some situations that are based upon windows of opportunity, and a window opens, and sometimes you have to try to get in when you can, and there's windows that close, and there's no way to do what you're going to do. And the basic principle has to become then, what's the will of the Creator in this situation? What's the best that I can do to draw close to the Creator, irregardless of it? And a person who, the people I've seen most successful at trying to get the right kind of conversions from the right scenarios and the right people are usually people who say, I don't care about the conversion itself, I just want to draw close to Hashem. I want to draw close to the Creator of all things. The conversion is just a path to part of that, but it's not the path. It's like a step on the way. And whenever that happens, that's when it's going to happen. And I remember once helping a woman who she grew up in Spain, and she had a situation where she, I think, had like a Jewish father but not a Jewish mother, which required her to go through a conversion. And she had heard in Spain that she should move to Arizona. to do, and I think it's somewhere around here. Sorry if I don't remember, but she had heard that that's the place to go. Unfortunately, that's in the United States at the time, at least. That's not the first place you go to. It's either like New York over here or Los Angeles. But that's where she ended up, and she ended up doing a conservative conversion until she found out that the conservative conversion didn't hold weight in a lot of areas. So she moved to Los Angeles and essentially tried to do conversion there. But when she went to one rabbi, one bet dean, they essentially told her that it was going to cost her several $100s just to talk to them, and then if they decide to take her, several $1,000s. And they were recognized by the rabbinut here in Israel. Eventually, what happened was, I was working with her. My cousin had referred me to her to like talk to me about it. So one of the things that happened was I eventually kind of coached her, and what she did was she found a rabbi who was not recognized in Israel, but that he was still like someone who was doing an Orthodox conversion, for example, and she converted through him because she did not have a desire to move to Israel. So that was perfectly fine. Now, generally speaking, the way that these things were done in ancient times, like I mentioned in I think another video, is that a person who converted, let's say, before the state of Israel, before, let's say 300 years ago, somebody was living, like we said, in Morocco, and they decided they wanted to be Jewish. They would go to the Jewish community of Morocco. They would, if the Moroccan Bet Din had accepted them, or, community Bet Din somewhere in Morocco had accepted them, then they would simply join that community, let's say here in Morocco. They'd marry into that community. And then several generations later, it'd be like as if they never were, like a non-Jew was never even there. They're Jewish the minute that they come out of the mikvah, and it's as if that past was never there, because nobody would have gone back and said, okay, well, let's say 500 years ago there was somebody who converted. I mean, it didn't matter. It's 500 years ago. Everybody who descends from them now, especially since they would have eventually have married within the Jewish community, it's like, okay, well, they're Jewish. It doesn't matter anymore. So coming to the state of Israel, somebody, whatever family that would have been, would be perfectly Jewish because that's been several hundred years past. Now with the state of Israel, the state of Israel is a secular nation. So one of the concerns that some people may have is, okay, there are people who only want to be Jewish now that we are back with the ability to have a country again. But when we didn't have a country, people weren't knocking down the doors to be, converting to Judaism because we were, getting our butts kicked everywhere. So it's almost like someone being bullied and someone else saying, I want to give that, I want to be with that kid who's being bullied. I want to be right next to him. I want to be his best friend. I mean, until he, becomes like the most popular kid in school, it might be that somebody says, "No, I don't want to be with that kid. He's getting, beat up all over the place." Now all of a sudden, it's like, oh, well, now he's on top. He's won the lottery. Let's be friends now. I mean, like, well, where were you when I didn't win the lottery? And that's the kind of perspective that exists. So that doesn't mean that every person wants to be Jewish. That's what their thing is. It just simply means that that's the perspective, that it's a lot harder now. And it's important. And I noted this in my other video, that during the time of David, King David, David Melech and Shlomo Melech, Solomon, during David and Solomon's reign and rule as kings of Israel, we're told, according to Jewish texts, that they did not perform conversions, that the official Bet Deans, the official, if you will, rabbinical councils at the time, did not do conversions, and only like the people who were just kind of off the street, like regular Joes on the street, who may or may not have known Torah very well, were doing conversions, and that caused a big problem. Essentially, they were not experts in the Torah to know how to do a conversion correctly, and that caused several problems. And that's where we're told that during the time when Israel has like a rulership, those kind of things will be cut off for the most part, because at the point that someone may look and say over here, oh well, the Jews are doing well, let me just join them right now, since they're doing well. But the minute we're doing bad, no, no, don't want to be Jewish. So that's the thing that has to be taken into consideration. So what's my advice of how for someone to handle this whole situation, especially given the COVID-19? My advice is to learn what you can learn, do what you can do to draw close to Hashem, and concentrate on that first. And if at some point an opportunity allows itself to present itself, if Hashem causes something to happen, then you have to know when to step in if that's what the situation is, but you also have to recognize that, I mean, Jewish communities are in survival mode, just like everybody's in survival mode right now. So again, the main thing to remember is conversion is not the high priority right now. Survival is the highest priority. And that includes for the person who wants to convert. I mean, at the end of the day, your survival through this, pandemic is, a lot higher priority than being Jewish right now. I mean, that's the thing. That doesn't mean, being Jewish doesn't guarantee anything. I mean, let's say that you're in Oklahoma and the Jewish community does put you through conversion, but again, you don't know Hebrew, there's no meetings at the synagogues because of the Corona situation. Everybody's isolated at home. What's the difference between that and what you're doing right now in the situation that you're in? There may not be any difference at all depending on where you live. And that's the reality that people have to accept, that right now we're in a certain window of history where the ability to do certain things like that or the advantage to it may not be there. So again, I'm not one of those people to tell someone, like, hey, don't do it or this and that. But the Jewish community does have a requirement to vet, meaning that the Jewish community has the responsibility to make sure that for their community, which conversions right now are a community basis, works for them. There's some communities that don't do conversions, and it's just they don't have the facilities to do it. They don't have the bandwidth to be able to do it, and that's just reality. Again, this is not a religious situation. That's the way a person has to look at it. You have to take the Western concept of religion out of the picture, where a person just goes in and says, I'm going to follow this creed, I'm going to do this thing here, and then I'm accepted in the religion, that's it. That's not the way the Torah presents anything. The Torah presents it as you have to know what the truth is. If the Torah is true, if the Jewish people have this blessing from the creator of all things concerning the land of Israel, that doesn't mean the world is all bad and evil because of that. That simply means that they have a responsibility, Jews have a responsibility. So this is as far as I think I can go with this topic, and this is Ehav Ever from the Chronicles of Ehav Ever. And I think I hopefully have covered this as much as possible to where it can be understood. And I hope that whoever this is going towards, it helps in some format. So take care. Bye bye.